Hello, Creepy Storytime listeners. Good evening. Tonight, we will share some terrifying stories to accompany your sleep. But before we begin, if you don't mind, please leave a comment below telling us where you're from and what time you're listening to this. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe as well. Let's get started with the story. Emily had always been a creature of habit, a young woman who found comfort in routines. But one crisp autumn evening, craving a break from her ordinary life, she decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was nestled by a small lake, far away from the bustle of city life, a place where she could breathe, relax, and perhaps regain some peace of mind. The drive had been long, but the forest around her was beautiful, bathed in golden and red hues as the trees shed their leaves. The air was fresh and clean, and Emily's excitement grew as she approached the small wooden cabin. That night, she settled in with a cup of tea, cozy by the fireplace. The only sounds were the occasional crack of the logs in the hearth and the wind rustling the trees outside. But the stillness felt strange, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. When the clock struck midnight, a faint noise disturbed the silence, a soft knocking on the door. Emily, puzzled, opened the door, half expecting to see a raccoon or some other forest creature. But what she saw made her heart skip a beat. Standing in the doorway was a man, a tall, gaunt figure with an unkempt beard and tattered clothes, as though he had been walking for days. His face was obscured by a dark, wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes were hidden under the shadow it cast. He looked out of place, like a relic from another time. His presence was unsettling, yet strangely calm. "Excuse me, miss," the man said, his voice gravelly. "I've lost my way. Would you mind if I rested here for a while?" Despite her unease, Emily couldn't bring herself to shut the door. Something about him was captivating, though she couldn't place why. She stepped aside, allowing him in. "Thank you," he muttered, his eyes flicking briefly to hers. The air around him was unnaturally cold, and the firelight flickered as if disturbed by an unseen draft. As he sat down by the fire, Emily studied him. He looked as if he hadn't bathed in weeks, his clothes torn and weathered by time. There was a strange aura about him, almost as if he didn't belong in this world. And yet, she couldn't help but feel drawn to him. It was as if something inside her told her he knew things she didn't understand. "You've been out there for a long time, haven't you?" Emily asked, trying to break the silence. The man looked at her then, and his eyes, cold, distant, and yet filled with sorrow, met hers. "Yes," he said softly, "for longer than you can imagine." She shuddered but didn't look away. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a slow, almost sad smile. "I am no one," he replied, "but I am everything that lives here in the shadows. I am the one who has witnessed all the stories these woods hold, the ones you don't believe, the ones that haunt the night." Emily's heart raced. She took a step back. "What are you talking about?" The man's smile faded, and his gaze grew distant. "Do you ever wonder why the forest feels so alive? Why it seems to watch you, even when you're alone? It's because the woods have a memory. It holds the stories of those who walked here before you, those who disappeared, or those who chose not to leave." A chill crept down Emily's spine as she looked at him, her mouth dry. "What do you mean? Are you saying people disappear in these woods?" The man nodded slowly. "Yes, many have come seeking solitude like you, but not all of them leave. Some find themselves lost in the mist." As he spoke, the room grew colder still. The fire crackled weakly, struggling to maintain its warmth. Emily looked at the man in confusion. The man stood suddenly, his movements stiff, as if something was forcing him to do so. His voice grew softer, more urgent. Listen carefully, miss. If you hear the wind call your name tonight, do not answer. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not look back. And if you see the mist roll in from the woods, you must leave. It's never just fog, no, it's the veil between what is and what was. The things lost in the forest are never truly gone. They only wait. Emily's heart pounded. Her instinct was to tell him to leave, to slam the door and lock it. But something about his words, his strange presence, made her hesitate. The man took a step toward the door, his head lowered. "I must go now," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But remember, the woods are not empty. You might not be alone even when you think you are. And the forest knows who belongs and who does not." Before Emily could react, he turned and walked out into the night, disappearing into the mist that had suddenly rolled in from the trees. She could hear his footsteps, echoing in the silence of the night, growing fainter until they were gone. But when Emily turned back to the fire, her heart sank. The room was empty. There were no signs of him, no footprints in the dust, no trace of his presence. She rushed to the door and flung it open, only to find the mist swirling around her cabin, thick and unwelcoming. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest whispers. Emily's eyes widened in terror. Her name, her full name, was being called out from the darkness. Emily, panic overtook her. She slammed the door shut, locking it tightly. But deep down, she knew the man wasn't gone. And whatever he wasn't just a lost traveler. He was part of the forest. And now the forest was calling her. In a small, isolated village nestled between the mountains, there was an old mansion that everyone avoided. The locals whispered about it, calling it the Whispering House. No one had lived there for decades, and over the years, the once grand estate had decayed into a crumbling ruin. Despite its eerie appearance, it still stood, towering over the village like a forgotten relic. One chilly autumn evening, a young couple, Sarah and Mark, decided to take a short trip to the village to escape the bustling city life. As they arrived, they heard rumors from the villagers about strange happenings at the mansion. Sarah, intrigued by the stories, insisted they visit it. Mark, although hesitant, agreed. As they approached the mansion, the wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak and sway. The large iron gate was half open, rusted and twisted. With each step they took towards the house, the air grew colder, and the sky darkened, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The front door creaked open with an unsettling groan as they stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and decay, the wooden floors warped under their feet. A dim light filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Mark frowned and strained his ears. At first, all he could hear was the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But then, there it was, faint whispers, as if hundreds of voices were murmuring from the walls themselves. They moved deeper into the mansion, following the whispers. The shadows around them seemed to shift and stretch, becoming darker and more menacing with every passing moment. The air felt heavy, pressing down on them, and their footsteps echoed eerily through the empty halls. Suddenly, they reached a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. The whispers grew louder, clearer, almost as if they were beckoning them. Without thinking, Sarah descended first, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Mark reluctantly followed, his heart racing in his chest. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a large, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old, cracked mirror. The whispers were deafening now, and as Sarah stepped closer to the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A reflection of a woman standing behind her. The woman's face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, and her mouth stretched into a twisted grin. Before Sarah could scream, the woman's hand reached out from the mirror, grabbing her wrist with an icy grip. Mark lunged forward to pull her away, but as his hand touched Sarah's, he felt the same chilling cold creeping up his arm. The room seemed to spin, and the shadows around them came alive, crawling toward them like living creatures. The whispers turned into shrill, agonized screams. "Leave before it's too late. Join us forever." With all the strength they had left, they broke free from the mirror's grasp, running back up the stairs. The mansion seemed to close in on them, the walls pulsating and shifting like a living nightmare. Just as they reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. They turned, only to see the woman from the mirror standing at the top of the stairs. Her grin widened, her eyes glowing with malice. "You cannot escape," she whispered, her voice a deathly hiss. Terrified, they turned back to the door, but it was locked, trapped inside with the shadows. Hours passed, and the villagers reported hearing strange noises coming from the mansion that night. They said they could hear two voices calling out, one pleading for help, the other forever lost in the whispers. No one ever saw Sarah and Mark again. Some say they became part of the house itself, their souls trapped in the shadows, their whispers joining those of the lost spirits that haunt the mansion to this day. It was a rainy night when Ella and her younger brother, Leo, moved into the old house on Maple Street. The place was cheap, and after their parents' sudden passing, they didn't have much of a choice. The house was large, with creaky wooden floors, peeling wallpaper, and an oppressive atmosphere that made the air feel thick. The neighbors had warned them. "This house has a history," one old woman said, but Ella, desperate to start fresh, brushed off the warning. "Just old stories," she told Leo as they unloaded their belongings. The first night, they tried to make the best of things. The house was cold, but they huddled together, eating takeout and trying to get some rest. It wasn't until midnight that the strange noises began. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound from the walls. Leo, ever curious, insisted it was just rats. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew louder, like someone was tapping on the walls with long, bony fingers. Every so often, Ella would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of her eye, shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally or flicker like a candle about to burn out. One night, Leo woke up screaming. Ella rushed into his room, finding him sitting on the edge of his bed, pale and shaking. "There's someone in the house," Leo whispered. "I saw them in the hallway." Ella dismissed it as a bad dream, but Leo wouldn't stop. He swore he had seen a woman in a white dress, standing motionless at the end of the hallway, her face hidden in shadow. When Ella checked, the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing down on her chest. The days went by, and things only got worse. The temperature in the house dropped drastically at night, despite the heating being on full blast. The mirrors fogged up with condensation even when no one was nearby. But the worst part came when they discovered the attic. One evening, while looking for something in the storage closet, Ella found a small door hidden behind a bookshelf. Her heart pounded as she opened it to reveal a steep staircase leading up into darkness. She hadn't noticed it when they moved in. Against her better judgment, she climbed the stairs alone. The air up there was stale, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. Dust and cobwebs covered everything. In the corner of the attic was a large, antique trunk. As Ella approached, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like she was being suffocated by the very air in the room. She opened the trunk with shaking hands. Inside, There was nothing but a large, dusty portrait of a woman in a white dress, her face pale and expressionless. The eyes in the painting seemed to follow Ella, and the longer she stared, the more she felt a cold presence behind her. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, and Ella spun around to find herself trapped. She reached for the doorknob, but something pulled her back. Cold fingers seemed to wrap around her wrist, pulling her into the darkness. In a panic, she screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls of the house. When Leo found her later that night, she was standing motionless in front of the attic door, staring at the painting with a vacant look in her eyes. She didn't speak for days after that. Her skin grew pale, her eyes hollow, and her once lively demeanor turned to nothing more than a shell of fear. Leo was left alone, but the whispers started again. The scratching grew louder at night. He could no longer deny the truth. There was something in the house with them, something that wanted them to stay. One evening, Leo ventured up to the attic himself, determined to find out what had happened to his sister. He opened the trunk and found the same painting, but now the woman in the white dress was no longer standing still. She was smiling, a wide, twisted grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally across her face. Before Leo could react, the attic door slammed shut, and he felt the temperature drop. The whispering voices filled his ears, a chorus of voices, beckoning him to join them. But it wasn't the voices that terrified him most. It was the image of his sister, standing motionless in the corner of the attic, her eyes empty and her skin as pale as the woman in the painting. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the deafening silence. The woman's smile grew wider, and the last thing Leo saw before the darkness consumed him was Ella's outstretched hand, reaching toward him, inviting him to join the cursed family of Maple Street. The next morning, the house was quiet again, but the neighbors said they saw something strange. Two figures in the attic window, standing side by side, gazing out at the street. No one ever moved into the house on Maple Street again. But late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, you can still hear the whispers of Ella and Leo, trapped forever in the house, waiting for the next soul to claim. It was a normal day for Hannah when she moved into her new apartment. She had just started a new job in the city and found a small but charming one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood. The apartment had old wooden floors, white walls, and large windows that allowed plenty of sunlight to stream through. But there was one thing about the place that stood out: an antique, full-length mirror in the hallway. It was framed in dark wood, intricate carvings lining its edges. Hannah didn't think much of it at first, but there was something unsettling about the way it reflected the hallway. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful. Hannah unpacked her things, set up her new space, and settled into her routine. However, over time, she began to feel strange when passing by the mirror. It wasn't like a feeling of being watched, more like the reflection of the hallway never seemed quite right. It looked off. The light would shift in strange ways, casting shadows in places that didn't align with how the room should look. One evening, after a long day at work, Hannah walked past the mirror and noticed something different. For the briefest moment, she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her in the reflection. It wasn't there when she glanced over her shoulder, but in the mirror, it loomed. A tall, thin figure, its features indistinguishable, like a dark, cloud-like presence. She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. Must be the exhaustion, she thought, brushing it off as she went to bed. But the next night, it happened again. This time, she was standing closer to the mirror when she saw the figure, clear as day, moving toward her. It seemed to step out of the darkness, its outline becoming more defined, but no details, just the black shape of a person. She immediately stepped back, her breath shallow and erratic, But when she turned around, there was no one there. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that mirror. Days passed, and the feeling only grew stronger. The figure was no longer just appearing at random. It started showing up at specific times. Always in the hallway, always in the reflection. Sometimes the figure would be standing perfectly still, staring at her. Other times, it would slowly move, as if it were watching her every move. One night, after the figure appeared again, this time standing right behind her, Hannah had had enough. She decided to confront whatever it was. She stood in front of the mirror and demanded, "Who are you? What do you want?" The room went deathly still. For a long moment, nothing happened. But as she watched, the reflection of the hallway shifted. The figure didn't just stand there anymore. It grinned. The shape twisted, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. The grin wasn't human. It was wide, too wide, like it shouldn't have been possible for a face to stretch that much. Terrified, she turned to run, but when she did, she saw the figure again. This time standing directly in front of her, just beyond the hallway's threshold. The same face, the same smile, now inches away from her. She screamed, but no sound escaped. The figure reached out, its cold, shadowy hand closing around her wrist. In an instant, everything went black. When Hannah woke up, she was lying in her bed, drenched in sweat, heart racing. Had it been a nightmare? She shakily checked the hallway, but the mirror was still there, unchanged. The strange feeling lingered, though, like something had followed her back from the dream. The next morning, she decided to leave the apartment. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was the air in the apartment, the space itself that felt wrong. She quickly packed her things, unable to stay another night. The moving truck was on its way, but as she prepared to leave, she took one last look at the mirror. The shadowy figure was there again, but this time it was no longer a fleeting image. It was standing there, fully formed, in the reflection, staring directly at her. It grinned, and its lips parted to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "I told you not to leave," it whispered in a voice that seemed to echo in her mind. Hannah fled without looking back. She never returned to that apartment, and she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone what had really happened. But the image of that figure, that smile, still haunts her to this day. Some say that mirror is still there in that apartment, and if you look at it long enough, you'll see the shadow staring back at you, waiting to step out of the glass. And once you do, you might never leave. When Clara and her family moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, they were eager to start fresh. The house was large, with creaking floors, long hallways, and a sprawling attic that seemed to go on forever. Though it had been empty for years, Clara quickly grew fond of the house's charm. Its antique furniture, high ceilings, and the peaceful surroundings. But there was something in the attic that she couldn't shake. It all started when Clara's mother asked her to clean up the attic one afternoon. Clara, being the curious child she was, explored the dusty old boxes and forgotten relics of the past. As she was moving a box of old books, she noticed a large, ornate doll sitting on a shelf at the far end of the attic. The doll was unlike any she had ever seen. It had dark, lifelike eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Its porcelain skin was cracked, and its once beautiful dress was now faded and torn. But what struck her most was the smile. It wasn't a happy, innocent smile. It was a twisted, almost sinister expression, as if the doll was aware of something she wasn't. Clara's heart raced as she stared at it, unsure of why she felt so unsettled. She didn't want to touch it, but at the same time, she couldn't look away. As if on instinct, She reached out and picked up the doll. The moment her fingers brushed its cold porcelain skin, a chill ran through her spine. The air around her grew heavy, and she suddenly felt not alone. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she heard faint whispering noises coming from the direction of the attic. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the whispers grew louder. It almost sounded like a child giggling, followed by a soft, creaking sound, like someone walking across the floor above her. Clara tried to ignore it, telling herself it was nothing, but the whispers continued, and soon, she began to feel that the doll was not just an inanimate object. She couldn't explain it, but it was as though the doll was alive, watching her, waiting for something. Her unease grew with each passing night, and she couldn't bring herself to go back into the attic. Then, one evening, Clara's mother asked her to fetch something from the attic again. Reluctantly, Clara climbed up the stairs, her heart pounding. As she reached the top, she froze. There, sitting on the same shelf where she had left it, was the doll. But something was different. Its head had turned slightly, as if it was looking directly at her. Clara's blood ran cold. She knew she hadn't moved it. Terrified, she stepped back, only to hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers in the attic grew louder, now accompanied by soft, childlike laughter. It was as if the air itself was thick with an unseen presence. Suddenly, Clara's eyes were drawn to the doll once more. Its eyes were no longer looking straight ahead. They were now staring at her, almost accusingly. And then, as if in slow motion, the doll's lips moved. "Play with me," it whispered in a voice that sounded far too real. Clara screamed, dropping the doll as it fell to the floor with a heavy thud. She ran down the stairs and locked herself in her room, her heart racing. The whispers continued for hours that night, and the laughter echoed through the walls. But it wasn't just the sounds that terrified her. It was the feeling that the doll was still in the house, watching her every move. The next day, Clara's mother found the doll on the floor of the attic. She asked Clara why it had been moved, but Clara could only shake her head in fear. Her mother, dismissing it as a figment of Clara's imagination, placed the doll back on the shelf where it had been. But from that moment on, strange things began happening. Objects would go missing only to reappear in odd places. Doors would open and close on their own. The whispers, the footsteps, everything grew more frequent. And every time Clara passed the attic, she felt a cold, eerie presence watching her from the shadows. One night, Clara's parents were out, and she was left alone in the house. The whispers were louder than ever, filling the air with a sense of dread. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the attic, unable to resist the pull of the doll. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw the doll sitting on the shelf once again. But this time, its smile had changed. It was no longer a simple smile. It was a grotesque, wide grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. And then, something even more horrifying happened. The doll began to move on its own. Its head tilted slightly to the side, and it slowly crawled off the shelf, its porcelain limbs making an eerie scraping sound on the wood. Clara tried to run, but her feet felt like they were stuck in place. The doll began to crawl toward her, its eyes fixed on hers, its grin growing wider with every inch it moved. Before Clara could react, the doll reached out with a cold, skeletal hand and touched her ankle. The contact sent a jolt of freezing terror through her body, and she screamed, managing to break free from the spell. She ran down the stairs and out of the house, not daring to look back. The next morning, the doll was gone. Clara searched the entire house, but there was no trace of it. The whispers had stopped, and the house felt normal again. But Clara knew the truth. The doll was still out there, waiting for her to return. She never went back to the house on her own again, and to this day, no one knows what happened to the doll. Some say it's still out there, in an old attic somewhere, waiting for its next victim to play with. But if you ever find yourself alone in an old house, and you hear the soft giggle of a child, followed by the sound of porcelain scraping across the floor, you might want to run, because it may be the doll, looking for someone to play with forever. When David and his wife Sarah stumbled upon a small village on their hiking trip, they were intrigued. The village, hidden deep in the forest, had no sign of modern life. There were no cars, no streetlights, and only a few homes with smoke rising from chimneys. It was quaint, but there was an unsettling vibe in the air. The couple decided to spend the night there, as the villagers were welcoming. They offered them a place to stay, an old, creaky inn with rusted metal gates and faded curtains. Despite its worn appearance, the couple had no reason to refuse. That evening, David went for a walk, hoping to take some photographs of the beautiful, isolated place. As he wandered through the village, he noticed that all the villagers, despite their warm greetings, never seemed to speak after dark. They would only stare, vacant, hollow eyes following his every move. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and a bone-chilling fog rolled in. The streets were now empty. No children played. No laughter echoed in the homes. He returned to the inn, but as night settled in, he heard whispers coming from the walls. Sarah, feeling uneasy, locked the door, but the whispers only grew louder. In the middle of the night, they woke to the sound of muffled footsteps outside their window. Sarah peered out to see villagers standing in the street, facing their room. Their faces were distorted, eyes hollow, their bodies rigid and unmoving. When David tried to leave, the door wouldn't budge. The room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in. Panicked, they both tried to escape through the window, but when they looked outside, they realized the village was gone. The fog had swallowed the entire village, leaving only empty woods in its wake. The couple had vanished along with it. James had always been an avid hiker, but on this particular trip, something felt different. He had set out for a solo adventure in the thick, ancient forest that bordered the mountain range. The sun was just beginning to set as he took his first steps onto the narrow trail, the trees towering above him, their branches entwining like skeletal hands. He hadn't thought twice about the warnings he'd heard from locals. Never wander too deep, they had said. Stay on the main paths. But James, determined to experience the wild in solitude, dismissed the cautionary tales. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth and tangled vines, making it hard to see far ahead. By midday, the forest's serene beauty had slowly transformed. The stillness grew oppressive, and the silence around him became thick, almost suffocating. He hadn't encountered any wildlife, nor did he hear the usual birds or insects. It was as if the entire forest had been holding its breath. When he finally realized he'd lost track of the trail, the dread began to creep in. His map was useless, as the symbols and trails on it didn't seem to match the landscape. Panic began to set in as the sun dipped lower, casting long, ominous shadows across the forest floor. He tried to backtrack, but no matter which direction he went, the trees seemed to shift, subtly but disturbingly, creating an impenetrable labyrinth. Each step he took seemed to lead him further into the heart of the forest, and the light was quickly fading. His phone had no signal, and he felt the gnawing fear in his chest that he was truly alone, cut off from the world. As dusk turned into night, James stumbled upon a strange structure, a crumbling, old building in the middle of the forest. It looked like an abandoned chapel or perhaps a small monastery, but its architecture was ancient and unsettling. The stone walls were cracked, and the roof had caved in on one side, leaving jagged beams exposed to the sky. The structure seemed out of place, as though it had been swallowed by the forest itself. Desperate for shelter, James entered the building. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The only light came from the dim, fading moonlight streaming through gaps in the broken walls. He could hear the creaking of the structure as the wind whispered through the cracks, sending chills down his spine. He tried to calm himself, deciding to rest there for the night, hoping the morning would bring clarity and a way out. As he settled into a corner, wrapping himself in his jacket for warmth, he began to notice strange markings on the walls. Symbols carved deep into the stone, twisting and intertwining like a language he couldn't understand. His eyes began to play tricks on him, the shadows seeming to move in strange patterns, almost as though they were alive. The night stretched on, and with it the unease grew. At first, James thought he heard faint whispers, like the rustling of leaves in a far-off breeze, but the sound seemed to come from within the building itself. His heart raced as the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and seemed to be calling his name. James, the voice hissed, soft and pleading. His breath caught in his throat, and he stood up, heart pounding, but no one was there. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching him from the darkness. He turned to see nothing but shadows. The air grew colder, and the whispers became frantic, almost frantic as though something was watching him, something waiting. In his panic, he grabbed his backpack and rushed toward the door, only to be met by a strange sight. The entrance was now blocked by an ethereal mist that had never been there before. It was thick, swirling in unnatural patterns, and the path he had come from was gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch forever. His breath quickened, his mind racing for a way out. That's when the shadows began to move. From the corners of the room, figures began to emerge, not fully human, but twisted, skeletal forms that shuffled slowly toward him. Their eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light, and their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. One of the figures, taller than the rest, stepped forward and spoke in a low, guttural voice. "You should not have come here." Frozen in fear, James stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The mist swirled, closing in around him, and the figures began to circle. He could feel their cold, clammy hands reaching for him, their hollow eyes boring into him with a hunger he couldn't escape. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and he could hear the faint sound of chanting in an ancient language, echoing from the depths of the building. A low, rumbling noise filled the air as the walls seemed to close in, and the figures reached out, pulling him toward the darkness. Just as he felt the cold grip of the shadowy figure on his arm, everything went silent. The shadows stopped moving, the mist faded, and the building seemed to go still. For a moment, James dared to hope it was over, but then he looked around. The figures were gone. The building was empty, but the door that once led outside was now sealed shut. No light, no way out, and as he turned to face the darkness, the whispering started again. This time it wasn't a name. It was a warning. You are lost. Forever. When Emma and Jake first moved into their new house, it felt like a dream come true. Nestled on the outskirts of town, the house stood tall and elegant, with ivy creeping up its stone walls. The spacious rooms, the large windows, and the quiet neighborhood seemed perfect for a fresh start. But from the very first night, something felt off. It was subtle at first. Whispers in the hallways when no one was around, cold drafts that lingered despite the heater running. But it didn't take long for the strange occurrences to intensify. One evening, as Emma was unpacking in the attic, she found an old, dusty mirror leaning against the far wall. It was unlike anything she had seen before, carved with intricate designs and tarnished gold. She dragged it into the bedroom, thinking it might look nice on the wall. As she set it down, she noticed something odd in the reflection. A shadow standing behind her. Spinning around, there was no one. She chalked it up to her imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left her. The next day, Jake heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway at night. They were faint at first, like someone was walking just out of sight. But each night, the footsteps grew louder and closer, until they stopped right outside their bedroom door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. That night, as they lay in bed, Emma felt a cold breath on her neck. She jolted awake, her heart racing. She turned to Jake, but he was fast asleep. The breath came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child giggling softly in the distance. The house was silent again, but the sense of dread remained. The days went on, and the occurrences escalated. Objects would move on their own. Books falling from shelves, cups shifting across countertops. At night, the air would grow thick with the scent of something rotting, though no source could be found. One evening, Emma went down to the basement to find a fuse box. As she descended the stairs, she caught sight of something in the corner of the room. A shadow crouched in the dark. Her heart stopped when she realized it was not a shadow at all, but a figure. A thin, pale woman with hollow eyes, staring at her with a chilling grin. Terrified, she ran upstairs and locked the basement door. When she told Jake, he was skeptical. But the next night, as they sat together in the living room, they heard it. The sound of soft, unsteady footsteps creeping up from the basement, followed by the high-pitched whisper of a voice. "Go away. Leave." That was the last straw. They packed their bags and left the house, never looking back. The house still stands on the hill, its windows dark and its walls silent. But every now and then, if you pass by at night, you might catch a glimpse of the same pale woman, staring out from one of those windows, waiting for the next unwitting soul to make the same mistake they did. The old house on Willow Street had always been a mystery. For years, people had passed by, whispering rumors of its haunted past. Yet, when Laura and her family moved in, they were eager for a fresh start. The house, with its peeling paint and creaky floors, seemed like it had potential, just needed a little love, they thought. It didn't take long for Laura to realize that the house had secrets. Secrets that it wasn't willing to let go of easily. On the first night, as Laura settled into her new bedroom, she felt a strange unease. The air was thick, and the house seemed to groan with every gust of wind. But what unsettled her most was the clock in the hallway. It ticked loudly, almost unnaturally so, and each time it struck midnight, there was a faint knocking sound from somewhere deep within the walls. At first, she assumed it was the house settling, but it didn't stop. The knocking continued, louder and more persistent with each passing night. A few days later, Laura was in the kitchen when she noticed something odd in the corner of her eye. A figure, barely visible, was standing in the living room doorway. It looked like a woman, pale with long dark hair that seemed to blend into the shadows. But when she turned to look, there was no one there. Her curiosity got the best of her. She began to investigate, looking into the history of the house. What she found sent a chill down her spine. The previous owners had vanished without a trace. There were reports of strange noises and sightings, but no one had ever been able to explain it. The house had been abandoned for years before Laura's family moved in. One evening, while cleaning out the attic, Laura found an old, dusty chest. Inside were various trinkets, but what caught her attention was an old photograph of a woman. standing in front of the house. The woman in the photo looked strikingly familiar, like the figure Laura had seen in the doorway. But the most disturbing part was the writing on the back of the photo. "She's still here. She never left." As night fell, the house grew colder. Laura decided to sleep with the lights on, hoping for some peace. But as she lay in bed, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing outside her door. Soft, deliberate steps, as though someone was walking up and down the hallway. The door creaked open, but there was no one there, just the cold, oppressive air. Laura got up to investigate, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the hallway, she froze. There, at the end of the hall, stood the same woman from the photograph. Her face was pale, and her eyes were hollow, empty, as if the woman's soul had long since vanished. In a panic, Laura ran down the stairs, her breath quickening. As she reached the front door, she turned to look one last time at the house. Through the window, she saw the woman, standing in the window watching her leave. Laura never returned to the house on Willow Street. The family moved out the next day, and the house was once again left to stand in silence, waiting for the next soul to discover its dark secrets. Many years ago, our son went through an extreme night terror phase that gradually morphed to include sleepwalking. He was only 3 at the time and not very articulate yet. He didn't seem to remember the night terrors and wasn't afraid of being alone in his room or even of going to bed on his own. Thither he would go without any prompting, and we'd go check on him and see his little sneakers neatly placed beside his bed, and him curled up under the covers in his PJs. We found that having him sleep in bed with us prevented these episodes altogether. So for weeks we did just that. It was a bit of a squash, but definitely beat the alternative. But shortly after we resorted to this fix was when the sleepwalking began. One night I felt him clamber over me, and groggily I assumed he had to go to the bathroom and almost instantly fell back to sleep. I woke to his terrified screams, disoriented about where he was. My husband found him, shaking uncontrollably, next to his bed, eyes dilated and blank with horror. We carried him back to our bed, holding him close, and waited for him to fall back asleep. This continued to happen off and on for weeks before my mom brought a lady who was a self-proclaimed Karandra, or witch doctor, to our home and had her cleanse it. She said our house had a lot of negative energy from previous tenants and restless spirits of small children who had become attached to our son. This was all horrifying to hear. We had experienced odd things, but none more disconcerting than our son's night terrors. The night terrors stopped after her cleansing, but other activity kicked up, and we continued to have our son sleep in our room, terrified that he'd have another episode. Some of the other experiences were knocks within the walls, doors opening on their own, pictures flying off the wall, doors slamming shut as you approached them, though no one was on the other side to have been able to slam them. We once experienced seeing the shadow of a person, a man walking around the house, but when we peeked outside there was no one there. The last straw was when the both of us had the same nightmare, woke drenched in sweat, and seeking comfort from the horrifying dream, only to tell it and realize we'd been dreaming nearly the same thing. In the dream, we were across the street, talking to our neighbors when they pointed out that our house was on fire. We looked back and saw that the house was enveloped in black smoke. We could see our son banging his fists helplessly against the front bay window. Panicked, we rushed across the street and into the house searching for him. In my dream, I found him and held him tightly to me as I ran back outside to safety, only to realize the bundle I held in my arms was his baby blanket and not him. I stared back at the house in time to see it collapse in a fury of flames and woke up screaming. My husband dreamt he went into the house and could hear my son crying out for him and couldn't find him. Then he heard a soft "daddy" and reached down and grabbed him up and ran outside. As he ran, he realized that our son felt very light in his arms, and when he looked down, he saw he was only holding a teddy bear. Needless to say, this rattled us even more. We promptly moved out, staying in my parents' small guest room until we could sell the house. It wasn't on the market long, and wanting to be upfront about our experiences, we told the buyer against our realtor's advice. He was a much older man who planned to use it as a rental property and waved off our experiences as nervous nonsense. It had been a long day of travel when Claire and her friends stumbled upon the old mansion perched atop a hill. The house, covered in ivy and overgrown with wild plants, stood like a forgotten relic. The air around it was still, and the wind seemed to avoid the property as if something were holding it back. Desiring adventure, the group decided to stay the night. As night fell, strange things began happening. Claire, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched, wandered through the abandoned mansion. The wooden floors creaked under her weight, and the smell of dampness hung thick in the air. Suddenly, she heard it, a low whisper, like a woman's voice calling her name from somewhere deeper in the house. Panic set in, but Claire tried to convince herself it was just the wind. She returned to the group, but their once lively chatter now seemed muted, as if the house itself was swallowing their voices. That night, as the wind howled outside, they could hear the faint sound of footsteps coming from the upstairs hall. They tried to ignore it, but as the hours passed, the footsteps grew louder, followed by the sound of doors creaking open. One by one, each of them was pulled from their sleep, paralyzed by the whispers and shadows that seemed to move around them. Claire was the first to dare venture upstairs, but she found nothing. The next morning, they decided to leave, but as they exited the house, they noticed something chilling. The door they had entered through the night before had vanished. In its place stood a solid wall of ivy. They were trapped, and then the whispers returned. Maya had always wanted to visit the countryside, and when she finally had the chance, she couldn't resist booking a weekend getaway at a beautiful, remote villa. The property, tucked in a lush forest, promised peace and quiet, perfect for someone who needed to escape the stresses of city life. As she arrived at the villa, Maya was greeted by an old caretaker who warned her, "This place is peaceful, but don't stay up too late. The night holds strange things." Maya, however, brushed off the warning, dismissing it as superstition. She was here for solitude, and nothing would ruin that. The first night, everything was peaceful. The villa had a strange, antique charm, and Maya found herself lost in the stories of the past that the house seemed to whisper to her. But as midnight struck, she began to hear soft, faint footsteps outside her bedroom door. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then the footsteps grew louder, as if someone or something was walking the halls deliberately. Unable to sleep, Maya decided to investigate. She tiptoed down the corridor, the floorboards groaning under her weight, but found nothing. The next few nights were worse. The noises didn't stop. Footsteps, muffled voices, the sounds of something scraping against the walls. One night, after hearing a heavy knock at her door, Maya mustered the courage to open it. To her horror, she found the hallway empty, but the air was thick with an oppressive chill, and she could swear she saw shadows flickering at the edge of her vision. By morning, Maya could no longer take it. She packed her bags, but as she stepped outside, she noticed something strange. None of the caretaker's warnings were true. The villa had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there for decades. Her questions went unanswered. There was no caretaker, and no way out. Shortly after my son was born, my then-husband and I bought a 100-year-old house for our expanding family, which included the three of us and our medium-large dog. As someone who grew up afraid of the dark, after a strange incident with a neighbor boy looking in my windows as a child, I repeatedly had to tell myself that the creaks and thumps and sounds were normal. For a house of that age with old-growth trees that bumped the roof and scraped the windows at night, and noisy radiant heat and a back gate that wouldn't stay shut and clanked in the wind. I'd hear something, and instead of investigating, I'd hide under the covers like any reasonable adult. When my then-husband and I split up, I kept the creaky house and he kept the medium-large dog. When my son was still small, the two of us were watching a movie in the front room around dusk when my phone died. As a Type B personality, the one charger I had was typically strewn somewhere about the house. This time I found it in the kitchen. But as I crossed to the counter to plug it in, I had the overwhelming goosebump, tingly sinking sense that something was very, very wrong. I turned and I realized that not only was the back gate open again, someone was sitting cross-legged in the yard, seemingly staring at the house. They had a hood and dark sunglasses, despite the fleeting light, and didn't move even when I stepped closer to the window to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They remained eerily motionless when I was certain they could see me, and still even when I was pretty sure they could see that I had seen them. I quickly locked the back door, grabbed my phone and my charger, and headed into the dining room to my laptop, where I sent the first person I could see online a message that someone was sitting in my yard staring at my house, and that my phone was dead, and to please call the police if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed whoever was in the yard would leave once sighted, but nevertheless waited on tenterhooks, impatiently staring at my still useless phone. After an awkward conversation with my son about why we weren't going to the kitchen to get a glass of water, it finally lit up and I was able to call 911. I tried to calmly explain to the dispatcher that I was sure the person was gone, but begged that they please send an officer to check my yard as the motionless staring was unsettling at best. Keeping me on the phone, she asked if I could look out a window without being seen to verify, as well as check the locked door. I awkwardly crept as stealthily as I could toward the kitchen, slowly realizing that while the back door was locked, it also had a very clearly too large dog door with no functioning way to block it. Panicking, I stood slightly in an attempt to scan the yard and came face to face with a hood and sunglasses staring down at me through the window. At this point, I was incoherent as the dispatcher urged me to grab my son and hightail it to a locked room. I dart back to him and explain we need to go, now, and as I pick him up I hear the clear and unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly swinging open. I abandoned the house, leaving the front door wide open, and dashed across the street to pound on my neighbor's door. Once inside, they kindly paused their dinner party to distract my son, while I stared across the street and messily sobbed about our very indoor cat we left behind. Not long after the officers arrived, they came through the side gate with hood and sunglasses in tow. They'd apprehended her calmly sitting on my back step, her arm lazily, purposefully swinging in and out of the dog door. I boarded the dog door shut that night, but we moved shortly thereafter, as I was never quite sure after that if all the nighttime knocks and bumps and open gates I'd been hearing were actually just the old house. And so, the shadows of the night settle in, wrapping you in their chilling embrace, leaving you to ponder the mysteries that lurk in the dark. We hope tonight's tales have both unnerved and captivated you, as you drift into a restless yet peaceful slumber, surrounded by the echoes of the stories you've just heard. At Creepy Storytime, we believe that a good story isn't just for a thrill. It's for reflection, relaxation, and the eerie comfort of the unknown. If you found yourself drawn to these stories, make sure to leave a comment and let us know which one gave you the chills, or if you've ever had an encounter of your own. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, so you never miss the next hauntingly captivating tale. You never know what secrets we'll uncover in our next episode. Until then, sleep tight, and remember, the dark isn't always as quiet as it seems. See you next time at Creepy Storytime.